A gunman opened fire at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida.
Our nation's worst terrorist attack since 9/11.
50 muertos, 53 heridos. Los primeros
That
nombres
this person did pledge loyalty to ISIS. The shooter targeted a nightclub where people came together to be with friends, to dance, and to sing, and to live.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Orlando, where the facts stubbornly resist the preconceived media narrative.
This is now being called a domestic terror incident.
A Syrian journalist exiled to Turkey escapes with his life for a second time. Kenya, the cartoonist and the newspaper that drew the line. And for sale, one online scandal sheet taken down by a vengeful tech billionaire. The deadliest mass shooting by a lone gunman in U.S. history, 49 killed in a gay club in Orlando, Florida. Americans are depressingly familiar with this kind of story and the set-piece aspect of the subsequent media coverage. Reporters piecing together fragments of facts, eyewitness footage on repeat, voiced over by a parade of talking heads filling in the gaps. Major news stories have a way of growing beyond the event. The massacre in Orlando became a story about the country, about gun control, America's mortal fear of enemies within, and inevitably about the race for the White House. Many in the LGBT community are saying that journalists let them down in their Orlando coverage, resorting to familiar narratives about terrorism and what both presidential candidates were calling radical Islam, well before we got the accounts of the gunman's secret life in the closet. That wasn't going to change Donald Trump's rhetoric. Radical Islam was the story, and he was sticking to it. And according to a new study, the U.S. news media, the filter American audiences rely upon to try to make sense of the world, are largely responsible for providing the platform on which the Republican candidate now stands. Our starting point this week is Orlando.
So in the first hours of this story, the American media was at its best.
There's breaking news at this hour from Orlando, where there are reports of a shooting at a nightclub.
It answered who, what, when, where, how. But that ended quite quickly, and the blame game began.
This is now being called a domestic terror incident.
The media wanted to grant ISIS responsibility.
The suspected shooter, Omar Mateen, called 911 after the shooting started.
Simply because there was one report of Omar Mateen pledging allegiance to ISIS.
But they weren't talking about the group that was targeted. And that, to me, kind of laid the bedrock of the coverage from there on.
Because beyond the who, what, when, where, and how is the why. And that was one of the questions where the initial coverage came up short. News crews had already converged on the mosque in Orlando.
What is this mosque like? What sort of preaching do you hear?
Reporters were digging into Omar Mateen's Afghan roots and his Muslim faith.
What triggered your son?
I am as shocked as you are.
When it turns out they should have been looking at his dating profile and focusing on the victims in order to understand what motivated the killer.
MSNBC's Chris Hayes visited an Orlando area LGBT organization, and that's where he met someone who claimed to have encountered the shooter on a gay dating app.
You recognize him for a gay dating app?
Yeah, I recognize him from Grindr.
And instead of being, well, this is terrorism, let's talk to terror analysts, they went to the scene and spoke to people and did a little bit of like old school reporting, right?
When you look at this crime and just imagine if the killer had not been killed, what would he be charged with? He would clearly be charged with a hate crime in this country. He was someone who was obsessed with hatred of gays and went to a gay club. Would he have been charged with terrorism? That's a very interesting question.
We're taking small snippets of anecdotes of what we've heard about Omar Mateen, and people were sort of transcribing it to what their preset sort of narrative about the shooting was.
We've been learning throughout the day about the gunman, Omar Mateen.
It's an example of the media immediately wanting to jump to who did it and what do we do. And I think a lot of that comes into the political response as well, and that the political response largely was to say that, hey, this is about either guns and gun violence, or, you know, many on the right were saying this is about Islamic extremism.
As predictable as the sun rising in the east, the Daily News blamed the NRA for this attack by connecting this dot that Omar Mateen, because he could buy a gun, could go into a club and start shooting people. And you have the New York Post, which is a more conservative paper, saying that this is ISIS versus the U.S. And that is a microcosm of American media, where we're so polarized that we could look at the same situation and come away with two completely different perspectives.
That debate was reflected through or projected onto the presidential election campaign via a question of terminology. Up until the Orlando massacre, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton had echoed the policy of the Obama administration in her refusal to use the term radical Islam, which she and the president both called inflammatory and therefore dangerous. Post-Orlando, Clinton changed her tune, used the term repeatedly.
Radical jihadism, radical Islamism, I'm happy to say either. Radical jihadism, radical Islamism, I think they mean the same thing.
And it echoed across the American airwaves.
Both Clinton and Trump have sort of seen an opportunity here to quote-unquote look presidential, because this is a moment of saturated media coverage where a lot of Americans feel like they do need sort of a strong leader at helm. And I think that the reason that both Trump and Clinton immediately went for the radicalist angle is because that's just the way that the political system of the United States and media system of the United States reacts to acts by Muslim Americans.
Well, you've also been reluctant to say we're fighting radical Islam.
Back in December, Hillary Clinton did an interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos, where she said we should never use the term radical Islam because it blames an entire religion.
That sounds like we are declaring war against a religion.
Then, just yesterday, she said, I have no problem saying radical Islam. And the reason why is there is no more Bernie Sanders in this election. There's no more left wing to appease because the opponent is different. So in this case, Donald Trump does, for lack of a better term, benefit here.
Radical Islam.
That so much of the coverage of a story that started in Orlando turned into coverage of Donald Trump should come as no surprise. A study released this past week by Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Media concluded Trump is arguably the first bona fide media-created presidential nominee. Although he subsequently tapped a political nerve, journalists fueled his launch. The conclusions were based on the disproportionately large amount of airtime and ink Trump attracted on 8 U.S. media outlets, what is called free media, and the tone of the coverage. He received far more good press than bad. And the study did not even include CNN, Fox, or MSNBC, news channels that have 24 hours of airtime to fill every day and gorge themselves on Donald Trump.
The media would literally set up news cameras at his events and just play his rallies live.
Let me interrupt you because the candidate has just appeared at the microphones at Trump Tower.
Anytime he makes an outlandish statement, that statement becomes saturated media coverage.
Many in the media did not do the kinds of stories they should have been doing about Donald Trump early on, what they call the deep dive on Donald Trump, the kinds of stories we're now seeing coming out about Trump University, about his business dealings, because they didn't treat him seriously. However, there was a recklessness in the way that they still gave him an enormous amount of time and attention because they knew that he was good television.
Some networks like CNN are attempting to do live fact-checking. NBC earlier this week fact-checked him on air.
There were a few errors in that speech, and we should point them out.
One of their broadcasters just started fact-checking Trump, and there can be an argument that, like, well, it's too late. Trump has the platform.
They didn't do the vetting. They didn't do the stories they usually do, and they gave him enormous access. I think it's less media manipulation and more media malpractice.
Consider where the story in Orlando began and what it has since come to be. There was the initial terrorism narrative based on the gunman's faith, before the facts, the apps, and the interviews made it more complicated than that. A tragedy quite possibly born of homophobia and self-denial. But by that time, the candidates had had their say, and that term, radical Islam, was back in vogue, where it will doubtless remain. Never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Never let them get in the way of a dominant narrative. Other media stories that are on our radar this week. Journalists go into exile for many reasons. Survival can be one of them. One Syrian journalist exiled in Turkey has now survived not one but two assassination attempts at the hands of ISIL. On June 12th, two gunmen on a motorbike shot Ahmet Abd Al-Qadar in the city of Urfa. He was hospitalized and is reportedly in stable condition. The Islamic State's official news agency, Amaq, claimed the group had carried out the attack. It's the second time the group has tried to kill the journalist in just 3 months. Al-Qadar is the managing editor of Eye on the Homeland, an online publication, FM radio station, and bi-monthly paper publishing in Arabic and English from Turkey. And Al-Qadar's brother, Ibrahim, who worked for the same outlet, and his colleague, Faraz Hamadi, were both killed in October of last year. The Islamic State also claimed responsibility for those murders. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, even in exile, Syrian journalists are not safe if they dare to report on the Islamic State. The Turkish security services should ensure that vital news sources such as Eye on the Homeland can operate safely. With some important local elections coming up in 2 months' time, the South African media are worth watching these days. And the state-owned broadcaster there, the SABC, has come under cyber attack. The SABC's website went offline June 12th at noon local time and stayed that way for 4 hours. A group calling itself Anonymous Africa has claimed responsibility, and the hacktivists say there are more attacks coming. The SABC has made a series of editorial policy decisions recently that have media critics in South Africa saying the network is in the tank for President Jacob Zuma's ANC government. It started 4 months back when the SABC banned listeners from phoning into current affairs radio programs as part of a procedure, the network said, to protect SABC against electioneering. Last week, the SABC said it would stop covering the country's newspapers in its news programming. The reason offered, it didn't want to give free publicity to the print media, which, according to the SABC's director, Claudi Motsoneng, are covering negative stories, misleading the people, and printing propaganda. Gawker, the gossipy American media site, has filed for bankruptcy, but it sounds like it's not going to go quietly. 3 months ago, Gawker lost a legal battle. It was sued by former wrestler Hulk Hogan, real name Terry Bollea. A Florida judge awarded Bollea $140 million in damages after Gawker published a sex tape involving him in 2012. Later, it was revealed that Bollea's legal fight had been secretly funded by Peter Thiel, a Silicon Valley billionaire who got rich through his company PayPal. Thiel's beef with Gawker goes back to 2007, when the site outed him as gay. Gawker also owns Jezebel and the tech blog Gizmodo and will be put up for auction in late July. Gawker's founder, Nick Denton, said he would continue to fight and that Thiel would not get his way. Even with his billions, Thiel will not silence our writers, he said. Our sites will thrive under new ownership and will win in court. Kenya is home to one of Africa's best-known political cartoonists, Godfrey Mwampembwa, better known as Gado. For the past 2 decades, Gado has used satire to make some salient political points and to hold power to account, not just in Kenya, but throughout East Africa. His work was published in the Nation Media Group and its flagship paper, the Nairobi-based Daily Nation. That all ended 3 months ago when Gado was fired. The circumstances are in dispute, but according to Gado, the pressure came from the top, not just the top of the media group, but from the government of President Uhuru Kenyatta. In Kenya, media freedoms tend to ebb and flow. In 2010, the country trumpeted its constitutional reforms that guaranteed press freedoms. But with elections coming up next year and with groups like Al-Shabaab from neighboring Somalia posing a security threat, some of those guarantees are not worth the constitutional paper they're written on. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now from Nairobi on Gado and what his story says about the state of the news media in Kenya.
This is Gado, and this is how he sees his own story.
I have religious leaders, terrorists, politicians, crooks, lawyers, feminists, and so forth. And what it says is, in your everyday work, you're probably going to annoy a certain section of the society, certain people.
To tell critical stories, then you have to criticize people of esteem in society. I mean, people who are considered to be leaders or people who are considered to be opinion makers, you know. They drive the national agenda. So he is right in saying that he has offended almost everyone.
Gado caused much of that offence while working for the Daily Nation, the Nation Media Group's biggest newspaper and widely considered Kenya's paper of record. Like most political cartoonists, it was often his visual devices that made his points and made him enemies. Like in 2011, when Deputy Prime Minister, now President Uhuru Kenyatta, was under investigation by the International Criminal Court for alleged crimes against humanity, Gado attached an ICC ball and chain around his leg. He put a turban on Deputy President William Ruto because of his alleged complicity in an illegal land grab involving a Sikh businessman. But it was this cartoon, published in January last year, that depicts what Gado called the sins of Tanzanian President Jakaya Kikwete, that was the beginning of the end for Gado at the Daily Nation, even though the cartoon was published in neighboring Tanzania in the Nation Media Group's regional paper, the East African.
It was one of the things that really just spoke to what was happening in Tanzania that often wasn't spoken about. Tanzanians, by East African standards, are politically active, but not as aggressive as, say, your Uganda or your Kenya. And so speaking about these things in a fashion that Gado did was something unnatural and perhaps even refreshing for them.
I don't think it's one of my harshest cartoons that I've done. I mean, I've done far much critical and far much ferocious drawings in the past. And so I was very surprised that caused the East Africa to be banned in Tanzania.
When the Kikwete administration banned the paper, the Nation Media Group scrambled to Tanzania to do some damage control. To keep the peace, Gado agreed to take 1 year of paid leave. But when the cartoonist tried to return to work, he was told that his contract would not be renewed. It was an unexpected end to a 2-decade-long working relationship, a symbiotic partnership where one party offered a platform and the other a satirical bite that would help earn the Nation Media Group a reputation for not pulling any political punches. But Gado is not the only journalist to be forced out of this news organization in recent months, and the question here in Nairobi is what's going on at one of Kenya's most influential newspapers. In January this year, managing editor Dennis Galava was fired after he wrote a critical op-ed about President Kenyatta. Then in March, the Sunday news editor Mugumo Munene and investigations editor Andrew Tiye were also fired in unclear circumstances. A lot of fingers are pointing at Tom Mshindi, who started as a journalist at the paper, then spent some time on the corporate side of things as the company's chief operating officer before returning to the news side as editor-in-chief.
These were insights that I got from a couple of senior reporters who didn't want to be named about what happened with Tom Mshindi after he became the chief operating officer some years back. The business side of things became more important to him than the journalism that he never really came back from, as us journalists call it, the dark side.
It's completely not true. I have directly not changed the journalism. I can't. My role as editor-in-chief is to make sure that the policy document, our editorial policy, that speaks to our independence as a newspaper company, as a TV company, as a media company, our responsibility to be fair to our subject, to be as objective as we can, and be sensitive to the various aspects and the various stakeholders that we deal with, is really what I do.
Gado, Galava, Munene and Tiye are all suing the Nation Media Group for unfair dismissal. In his affidavit, Galava claims that he was fired because he refused to play ball in Mshindi's, quote, insidious power games. The company could face a hefty legal bill, but it can probably afford it. The Nation Media Group is owned by Prince Karim Aga Khan, a British businessman with vast commercial interests in the region. Schools, universities, hospitals, hotels, banks, among many others, which rely on a good working relationship with the government to function effectively. Add to that the fact that government advertising is a crucial revenue stream for the Nation Media Group. But Mshindi calls the company's size a strength, not a weakness.
Because we are a big commercial company. We are able to withstand some of those pressures. Government, yes, is a significant advertiser, but not so significant that we cannot survive a withdrawal.
Government is a top advertiser. I think we are #1 now
the investment government makes on advertisement because of our law that most of our decisions have to be published in at least 3 newspapers. That alone opens up advertising as an obligatory measure for government. But we do not use advertising as a leverage on how media houses operate their business. It is in the interest of government to ensure private business succeeds.
That is what the government spokesman says. However, media freedom groups say that the free flow of information in Kenya has declined dramatically since President Kenyatta came into power, who himself has said that newspapers are only good for wrapping meat. It's a complicated story, so we asked Gado to sum it up in a cartoon about Kenya's media landscape.
This is my view that the media has abdicated its role. And I've used the famous the emperor without cloth and twisted it around, and what I have is the media without cloth, because I pretty much feel that the media in its own way has abdicated its role as the arbiter in public matters.
I believe that we are still very much executing this role, because I could challenge the cartoonists and say, what are we not doing currently? We are reporting very aggressively issues around corruption. We are reporting very aggressively around the inadequacy of institutions. We are focusing very aggressively on the performance of the public bodies.
I think that there's a changing of guard even at the lower levels, entry-level journalists. People who don't understand what it means to be able to defend the paper's right to pursue what it wants editorially. And that potentially is a dangerous thing, because then they'd be more malleable to commercial interests. Then they'd be more malleable to pressure from the managerial side of things, which other hardened journalists wouldn't have been.
It had never been an issue for editors to be sacked. So when stories about editors started coming up in the media and online critics picked it up, then the perception of the public is that there is something wrong with their industry.
If that is the perception, then the reality is that Kenya's media lack credibility. That leaves them and the Kenyatta government exposed, which is what Gado, the cartoonist turned media critic, is saying in his own way.
On the download now, our viewers on the state of the news media in Kenya.
When I first received the news about Gado being fired, I felt devastated about it, because I believe Gado was a great influence to the youth. He brought a new idea to the political world by putting it in a funny way. You can really understand what is happening in the political world, and I believe he should be given a new contract so you can get back to reading newspapers.
One big problem that I've had with the Kenyatta presidency is the use of terrorism as a label to arrest journalists for actually reporting on the news. Terrorism has been used as an overreach to actually impede on media freedoms.
And finally, the stories were overshadowed by what happened that night in Orlando. But did you know that there were 5 other mass shootings in the United States last weekend alone? Mass shootings are defined as 4 or more people shot in one incident, not including the gunman. And they occur in the U.S. on 5 out of every 6 days on average. American news outlets are now using infographics to tell that story. We've put together a few of them: statistics on the deadliest gun attacks on American soil, graphics summarizing the mass shootings this year alone, interactive information on the victims, the gunmen, the weapons, and the global comparison. For instance, in Japan, you are about as likely to be killed by someone with a gun as an American is likely to be struck by lightning. The data speaks for itself. The graphics help get it across. We'll see you here next time at The Listening Post.